Hello and welcome to our presentation on pruning techniques for multiplayer game trees. The contents of this presentation are as follows. First, we will talk about introduction, Maxn algorithm, basic pruning techniques, advanced pruning approaches, and then we will talk about the experimental results and its applications. We are Nishant Kumar, Rishav Anand, Nishant Kumar. And today we will explore how pruning algorithms work in games with more than 2 players. Our presentation is based primarily on the paper on pruning techniques for multiplayer games by Nathan Stewart Event and Richard Korf, which significantly advanced the field's understanding of this topic. So let's start. Let's start with the foundation of multiplayer game trees. A game tree is a graph that represents all possible game states and moves in a sequential game. Each node in the tree represents a state of the game, and each edge represents a possible move. In traditional two-player games like chess or checkers, we use Minimax algorithm to determine the best move. Minimax works on the assumption that one player one player tries to maximize their score while the other tries to minimize it. This creates a zero-sum game where one player's gain is another player's loss. However, multiplayer games introduce new challenges. When we have 3 or more players, we can no longer use a single value to represent the game state's worth. Instead, we need to track each player's individual scores. So, two-player versus multiplayer games. Here's why multiplayer games are different. First, in two-player games, we can represent any position with a single value that tells us how good it is for the maximizing player. In multiplayer games, we need multiple value, one for each player. Second, in two-player zero-sum games, where what good for one player is always bad for the other. But in multiplayer games, a move that hurts one opponent might help another, creating complex dynamics. Finally, and the most importantly for our topic today, pruning is much more challenging in multiplayer settings because we can't make the same assumption about opposing playing player goals. Now let's talk about the Maxn algorithm. The Maxn algorithm introduced by Lockhart and Irani in 1986. It extends the min-max concept to multiplayer games. Instead of single value, Maxn uses an n tuple of scores, where n is the number of players. Let me explain how it works using an example of 3-player game. This is a 3-player game tree. At top, player 1 makes the final decision. The next level shows player 2 choices and the bottom level contains player 3 decision. Each leaf node holds a score tuple in the form P1, P2, P3. For example, at one of the player 3's nodes, we compare 7, 3, 0 and 3, 5, minus 2. Since player 3 maximizes the third score, they chose 7, 3, 0. Moving up at node A, where player 2 decides, the backed up value from player 3 are 7, 3, 0 and 5, 2, 4. Player 2 selects 7, 3, 0 because its second score 3 is higher than 2. Finally, at root, player 1 compares the branches 7, 3, 0 versus 6, 2, 3 and picks 7, 3, 0 based on the highest first score. In a sense, each player picks the move that optimizes their own score component, which is the core idea behind Maxn algorithm. Score tuples in real games. In real card games like Hearts, the score tuple would represent the points each player has taken. In Sargent measure, also known as we can say 853, the tuple would show number of tricks each player has won. One important point is the concept of zero sum or constant sum games. In these games, the sum of all players' score is always less or the same. For example, in three-player hearts game, there are 26 points in total to be taken. In Sergeant Major, the with three players, there are exactly 16 tricks to be won. And these are two other cases which can also be helpful if we are trying to score tuples in real games. The duality of maximization and minimization. Before I hand over to Rishav, I want to briefly mention that we can transfer minimization problems like hearts, where you want to take fewer points, into maximization problems by simply negating the scores and adding a consonant. That lets us talk about the games as maximization problem without losing any generality. Now let's move on the heart of our presentation, pruning techniques for multiplayer game trees.
Mm. Hello, I am Rishav Anand. Thank you, Nishant. Mm, So, I move to the pruning theory and the basic techniques. Pru- Pruning is the method to avoid exploring branch of the game tree that wouldn't affect the final decision. This is a dramatically reduce computation time without changing the result. In two-player game, alpha beta is the extremely affected. It can reduce the number of nodes searched from b is to power d to approximately b is to power d by 2, where b is the branching factor and d is the search depth. This means we can search twice as depth in the same amount time. But in multiplayer game, pruning become the much more restricted. Let's explore why. Type of pruning in Maxn. In Maxn tree, there is three potential type of pruning: immediate pruning, shallow pruning, deep pruning. Let me explain each one. First of all, in immediate pruning is the simplest type. It is occur when a player achieve the maximum possible score. For example, in game where the maximum score is 10, if player 2 find a move the guarantee them 10 point, they can immediately prune all our sibling. Here an example from the paper: at node B, player 2 can go get 10 point by choosing to move toward the left child. Since 10 is the maximum possible score, player 2 can do no better. So after examining the first child, the second child can be pruned. Then come shallow pruning. Shallow pruning is more interesting. It uses bound from parent node to prune children in current node. For example, look at this three-player tree. At node A, player 1 can get at least 6 points by choosing the leftmost branch. When player 2 examining the first child of node B, player 2 get a score of 5, meaning player 2 will get at least 5 points by choosing the leftmost branch at B. Now here the key instant. If there are only 10 total points in the game and player 2 get at least 5 points at node B, then player 1 can get at most 10 minus 5 equal to 5 points at B. Since player 1 is guaranteed 6 points at A and at most 5 points at B, player 1 will never move towards B, so we can prune the remaining child of B. Then deep pruning. Deep pruning, why it's fail? You might wonder, can we use bound from grandparents node to prune at a grandchild? There would be deft pruning, and unfortunately it doesn't work in multiplayer game. Look at this example. Even though player 1 is guaranteed a grade, then what is the possible at node C? We can't prune node D because its value can affected which move player 2 chooses, which is turn affected the final outcome. If the value at D is 226, then player 3 choose this value. Player 2 at E choose 730 and the final result is 730. But if the value at D is 046 and result changes to 631. So why deep pruning would be valid in two-player game? It's fail multiplayer setting. Intuitive explanation. Let me explain the intuitive. In Sergeant measure player complete directly for limited resource tricks, where one player takes a trick other can't have it. This direct dependency between player score allow us to prune effectively. In in hearts, player try to avoid taking point. When one player avoids point, those point must go to the someone else. But there's no guarantee which player will take them. This lack of direct dependency between any two specific player score m- make prone much harder. Now I hand over Nishant who discuss more advanced pruning technique that can improve performance beyond what we have seen so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Rishabh. Hello, I am Nishant, and I would continue with advanced algorithms and performance. Now, now that we have understand the basics of pruning in multiplayer games, let's explore more advanced techniques that will provide additional performance improvements. So there are three key approaches. The first one is branch and bound pruning. The second one is alpha beta branch and bound. And the third one is paranoid algorithm. Now we will see all these three algorithms in next slides. Now, branch and bound pruning. Branch and bound is a pruning technique that uses monotonic heuristics to establish bounds on player scores. A monotonic heuristic is one where the value can only increase or maybe decrease as the game progresses. Many games have natural monotonic heuristics. For example, in Hearts or Surgeon Major game, once you have taken a trick or points, you cannot lose them. That means you can't go back in time. This gives a lower bound on each player's score. Here how it works. If we know that player 1 has already taken 3 tricks, then the heuristics of player 1 is greater than equal to 3. This means that player 1 final score will be at least 3. Similarly, if there are 16 tricks in total and the other players have taken 8 combined, then the heuristics of player 1 is less than equal to 8, which means that player 1 can get at most 8 tricks. Now let's move on to example of branch and bound. Let's imagine there's a node and it has a left child. Then player 2 can get a score of 9. If our heuristics tells that player 2 heuristic is less than equal to 9, meaning player 2 cannot score more than 9 points from this position onwards. Now we can immediately prune the remaining children. Similarly, shallow branch and bound pruning happens at node B when player's 1 heuristics guarantees a score of 5 or less, while player 1 can get 7 by moving to node A. Now we will move to alpha beta branch and bound. So, this is a hybrid approach. So, let's discuss about it. This technique combines both vector values and heuristic estimates to prune even more effectively. In the standard shallow pruning scenario, we have seen that we compare scores between two players. But in an n player game, what about the other players? Alpha beta branch and bound uses heuristics, lower bounds
for the remaining n-2 players to tighten our pruning bounds further. For example, if we have player 1 that has a guaranteed score of 6 at the root node, and at node A we know player 2 will get at least 3 points, and our heuristic says that player 3 will get at least 2 points. Since there the real upper bound on player 1 score is maximum sum minus score of 2 minus heuristics of player 3, which is 10 minus 3 minus 2 equal to 5 points. Since 5 is less than 6, the branch is pruned where standard pruning would not do that. So that's the best part of it. Now we will move to the paranoid algorithm. This is another approach which reduces an n-player game to a 2-player game. This is an interesting one. The idea is simple but powerful. Assume that all your components has formed a coalition against you. Then what would you do? But under this assumption, we have 2 players, you and the combined opposition. Now we can understand standard alpha beta pruning, which is more effective. Of course, the assumption is not realistic. Your opponents are trying to beat each other too. Not just you, but all of them. But the pruning power gain might outweigh the strategic inaccuracy in the practice. So that's how the paranoid algorithm works. Now let's move to some experimental results. This is a experiment where tested on a sergeant major game with 200 random game trees and a depth of 5 tricks, total 15 cards, and the results were quite impressive. Branch and bound and shallow pruning each reduced node expansion by a factor of about 100 compared to full tree expansion. Alpha beta branch and bound, which reduced expansion by an additional factor of 19 beyond these methods. Now, the third algorithm, which is paranoid algorithm, was 3 times better than the alpha beta branch and bound. And the last one, where you have used heuristic bounds with paranoid algorithm that reduced our expansion by another factor of 12. In total, the best method is our paranoid with heuristics that examined only 36,000 nodes on an average compared to total tree nodes, which is 3.33 billion, which is quite huge. That's nearly 100k times fewer nodes than the nodes which has been used in paranoids with heuristics. Now that's few of our practical applications. So this has been used in various multiplayer games. First one is the card games, which has some games like hearts, spades, and bridges. Some board games like Risk, Settlers of Catan, and some multiplayer computer strategy games as well, which has multiple independent players. Now, we have to find out the choice of algorithm on the basis of game's characteristics. So we can choose these type of things to understand which algorithm we can apply to which game. So based on the game type, we can find out whether it is a zero sum or constant sum. The second one is score dynamics, how players scored influence each other directly. And the third one is heuristics quality, about strong monotonic heuristics are available or not. Now I would move to the conclusion part. So, multiplayer game trees makes pruning more challenging than in two-player games. Maxn algorithm extends minimax but limits the pruning techniques. Shallow pruning depends on specific mathematical conditions. Advanced techniques improve efficiency and AI techniques. That's all the techniques that helps us to improve our pruning techniques further and help us to build a stronger algorithms. Now, that's all the end for it. Now, thanks for watching our video. Thank you all.